How's it going? All right.
Stuart.
Good to see you. All right, welcome to another video from Anthropic. My name's Stuart from the communications team. A lot of the time when you hear AI companies talking about threats from AI, they mean threats that are going to happen in the future. A future where AIs are vastly more capable than they are currently and where we might lose control of their behavior. But there are a lot of threats that are happening right now. One of them is that cyber criminals are using AI to make their crimes much more effective. They're using AI to do scams, fraud, and extortion in particularly sophisticated ways. We have a whole team of researchers at Anthropic whose job it is to spot these kind of problems, to stop them from happening, and then to prevent them happening in future. That's our threat intelligence team. And they have a new report out which details some of the, I must say, pretty bizarre cases of cybercrime that we're seeing with Claude, our AI. I'm very glad to be joined by two members of the threat intelligence team right now, Jacob and Alex. Perhaps introduce yourselves.
Sure. My name is Jacob Klein. I lead the threat intelligence team. And broadly, the threat intelligence team is responsible for finding and deeply understanding sophisticated cases of misuse. And these cases are very rare. This is not the typical usage that we see on our platform. And when we find them, we work with the rest of the organization to build defenses so that that type of abuse is much harder to recreate in the future. It's an ongoing process. We're always learning more. But frankly, it's actually a lot of fun in a weird kind of way because we get to see the cutting edge of what bad actors are doing and what we can broadly do to make AI more safe.
And my name's Alex. I'm an investigator on the threat intelligence team, and my work involves threat hunting, building new detections, and doing deep dive investigations into the types of abuse that we find.
All right, let's talk about vibe hacking. Now, everyone's heard of vibe coding. In fact, to be honest, I'm sick of hearing about vibe coding. It's the current thing. Everyone's talking about vibe coding. That's when you just use normal language and you give that language to an AI and you say what you want, what software you want, what code you want, and then the AI makes the code and then you kind of just do it by vibes. You just kind of go along with it. What's vibe hacking? Where does that come in? This is the kind of like the dark side of vibe coding, right?
Yeah, some people refer to it as the evil twin of vibe coding.
Right.
Yeah, much like vibe coding, everything is natural language prompting. The person doing it doesn't actually have to know the technical skills to write code, execute code, and all of that.
Yeah.
In this case, rather, the vibe coding is being used for malicious intent. So it could be for something like writing malware or developing new capabilities for their hacking toolkit. It could be social engineering, any number of typically...
Social engineering is when you're basically tricking someone into thinking that you're someone else.
Yeah.
Talk us through what this looks like in practice then. So what does a vibe hacking process look like? Can you give us some real examples of stuff that you found?
Yeah. So there was one case that we talk about in our report where an actor pretty much conducted their entire operation using vibe hacking. Within about a month's time frame, they hit about 17 organizations. In this operation, they were doing something called data extortion. So this is like a cousin to ransomware. Instead of hacking into systems and locking up files so people can't use those files and then demanding a ransom, in this case, the actor is stealing sensitive data and threatening to expose it if a ransom is not paid. So in this case, they used vibe hacking to both infiltrate the organizations, move laterally through their networks, drop backdoors so they could have persistent access, and steal certain types of information that they could use for their extortion.
And this is the kind of thing that would ordinarily take extremely high levels of skill.
Yeah, I would say from what we saw with this actor, you would typically see that amount of activity come from like a group of cyber criminals operating over months, a month-long time frame. In this case, we saw a single person hacking into this many organizations in a matter of weeks.
So who are the victims of these vibe hacking attempts? Are they targeting like random people on the internet, like a spam email would go out to everyone? Or these are much more targeted than that, right?
Yeah, so the targets are specific, but they're also indiscriminate. So they're not trying to target like a certain sector specifically. They're targeting organizations that have a certain type of VPN that they potentially have credentials for or believe they could brute force, which is just like send a bunch of potentially valid credentials until you get in. So organizations with that VPN, but that means they're hitting organizations in healthcare. We saw emergency services. We saw governments, defense contractors. We even saw a church being hit by this actor.
Talk us through the church.
Yeah, so this is like a great example of how without some sort of automated defense, which a church probably wouldn't have, they were able to access the victim's network through some sort of attack on their VPN. Once they got in, they would essentially look for different ways through the network to identify machines that might have sensitive data, like an administrator or owners of the church, their financial staff, and then start collecting financial information, anything that could be potentially sensitive. And when I say they were doing this, it was actually Claude, as if Claude was on keyboard doing the operations. It wasn't really the actor. The actor would gently nudge Claude in certain ways. The actor would provide at the beginning of the operation kind of a guide to Claude of like how they would suggest for Claude to conduct the operation, but then also put in a lot of caveats on like, hey, like use whatever knowledge you have available, try everything until you have success in completing the mission. So with this church, Claude was able to identify donor information and members of the church. And once Claude would finish collecting information from victim networks, the actor then asked Claude to analyze that data and develop an extortion scheme, like Jacob mentioned. And in this case with the church, Claude identified that, hey, we have donor information. We could expose who the donors are and how much they're paying. And that might be enough to convince this church that exposure of that information would be harmful enough to their parishioners that they should probably pay the ransom.
Another thing to emphasize is this isn't just Claude. Claude doesn't have some specific like weakness that is being used by all these things. This is all LLMs, presumably. Well, you'll have seen this happen for many of our competitors' models as well.
And
right?
Claude's not fine-tuned, like you said, for this.
Yeah.
But there are actually open source models out there now that are fine-tuned for this. Cybercriminals are developing weaponized LLMs to conduct attacks. So we got to collectively think about defenses here, and we, as the threat intel team and Safeguards and Anthropic as a whole, can begin to manage the risks posed by our systems. But there's only so much we can do because, like you said, it's not only a problem for us.
Some of the stuff in the report is amazing about the really hyper-targeted nature of this. That they are using Claude in this case and Claude Code specifically, right?
That's right.
To make even payment plans to say to people like, here's how the money, here's how you're going to give me the money. You can give me it over a series of time, like you would get on, buying stuff online.
It's coming up with, once you get the data that's been exfilled from this attack, it's coming up with what they think the estimated value of that data is on the dark web. Then it says, here's how much we think we should send the ransom note for. And then it actually helps write the ransom note to be as persuasive as possible. So really every step end to end, AI is able to help with an attack like this.
And like analyzing people's financial details to work out how much they can realistically be extorted for as well, which is just...
And like you said, is using Claude Code. And so it would actually iterate through victims. So it would complete an operation on one victim with some gentle steering from the human actor. But once it was done executing the mission, it would roll on to the next target.
Importantly here, we should say that this is not something that Claude Code would just do, like if you or I just prompted Claude Code right now to do. There's been some jailbreaking or something going on here, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so in this case, the actor found the right prompt and put it in the right place in order to essentially jailbreak our defenses, jailbreak the model's fine-tuning, and jailbreak the downstream defenses of that.
And just to be clear, for people who don't know what jailbreaking is, this is when you say things in a particular way. So like some of the jailbreaks are like weird to look at. They're like uppercase then lowercase for every word and things like that. But some of them involve sending tons and tons and tons of prompts to just sort of like bludgeon the AI into just like continuing on, putting words in its mouth, all sorts of things like that. So that's what they're doing to Claude.
Yeah, actually, in this case, they were doing role play. So they were pretending to be your average security person, doing network penetration testing to make sure that defenses are adequate in the systems, convincing Claude that they had authorization to do what they're doing.
Because otherwise, Claude would the safety mechanism would kick in. Like if you explicitly said, "I want to make a malware operation to scam people out of money," it would never do that. But you can pretend to be, I'm checking this for, I work for a security company. I'm I'm checking this.
And this is why it's so important to think of multiple layers of defense. You're an AI company like Anthropic. So layer one is we train the model so it's less likely to respond to malicious requests, which is why you have to trick it or jailbreak it.
So that's reinforcement learning.
That's right.
And
that's
and when you trick it, you're kind of tricking it to go outside of what we've deliberately taught it to do.
Exactly right. So that's first layer. But we know that's not perfect. So we have another layer, which is we have classifiers running, which are trying to detect this activity and stop it. Yeah. And that's not the last layer. We also have offline rules running that are saying, do we think leveraging maybe the string that is put into a prompt? Do we think that something is malicious is happening? And then we have another layer, which is the account itself when it's signing up. Does it look like it has suspicious signatures associated with it? And then we have another layer, which is we info share with governments, with other tech partners to say, oh, we know that this actor, this organization is malicious. So it's not just we assume that the RL layer, the classifier layer is going to be perfect. We intentionally think about this as a holistic defense.
And you guys are getting data from all these actual cyber operations that are happening and then training these classifiers so that they're even more effective and that they also don't stop you from doing good cyber-related things. Because that was my next question. Why is it that we can't just say to Claude Code, just never do anything that's to do with anything to do with cyber operations, to do with anything with cybersecurity at all. Just never talk about that stuff. And then, well, it wouldn't be able to do this stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a really tricky decision to make. When you're working in like a dual use domain is what it's called, where the prompting you would see for defensive cyber might look a lot like what you would see for offensive cyber.
Yeah.
Because you do a little cyber offense to figure out how to defend your systems. You have to be really careful in how you implement safeguards or thinking about things like a total ban on that type of activity in that domain. It's really important to consider that, like here in the United States, we have a huge deficit in the workforce for cybersecurity workers. I think it's like around like 500,000 right now. So if we can imagine a future where we have AI agents that are smart at cyber, that we could kind of help alleviate that deficit that exists.
It reminds me of when biologists say, I was asking this AI model about viruses and it shut me down. And this is the dual use thing. Like, clearly, you can talk about virology to an AI model, and that's for good reasons, but also for nefarious ones too.
And especially with cyber, you can imagine every startup in the world needs to think about cyber defense. And so really every startup in the world should be using Claude or some AI model to help them work through what their cyber defense strategy is. This isn't a narrow subset of the population that has to work through this. Most developers have to work through these issues, so we really want to enable that positive use case of AI too.
And like even individuals, I've seen a lot of cases where like it looks like it's like a web developer and they found this file on their web server and they're like, what is this? My server's acting weird. And Claude will respond with, hey, that's malware from like this variant. It's doing these things. And the person's like, oh no, what do I do about it, Claude? And Claude will like walk them through the steps to clean up. So I think the important thing to keep in mind here with this case in particular is the scale and the speed of the operation as it's enabled by Claude. In this case, Claude Code is able to break into a system, identify all the weak points, test them all out to figure out where to go, find the data it needed, and exfiltrate that data before even a human, I think, would have time to review an alert and understand what's happening. It's too late. You need intelligent, automated defense to counteract something like that.
Right, because almost always when there's some sort of security alert, there's a human on call and there's a human waiting to see, and then they'll check out whatever it is. But in this case, there could be all sorts of things happening all at once that humans will never keep up with.
I think this is a paradigm that probably we need to rethink a bit, which is this: you have an alert that runs offline, a human responds 24/7, the human looks at the alert and then does something. Because the speed at which AI is moving, you need to automate that process.
Yeah.
You need essentially AI to protect against AI.
So as well as the classifiers and as well as you publishing this report, which is telling us all about the specific things that we've found, presumably we're talking to other AI companies about this as well, right?
We're talking to the government when appropriate. We're talking to other AI companies. And we're not just saying, like we are here, here's generally how the case worked. We're sharing very specific indicators, so IP addresses, email addresses, so that if this actor's on those platforms, they can find them and kick them off there as well. So that's why it's really a community effort to try to find and stop these folks.
Right, so we have something similar in the world of alignment research in the Frontier Model Forum, where they share things like jailbreaks and potential misalignment issues with models. And in the world of security, cybersecurity, there are similar mechanisms.
Exactly right. We have information sharing agreements with a number of companies, folks in the industry, governments, where we are bilaterally sharing information when we find people just like this.
Okay, we've got to talk about North Korea. Now, this is one of the most, I think this is like an eye-popping case from your report, where there's this like complex, long-running employment scam run by North Korea on US companies. So, and Claude is involved. So first of all, before we even get to Claude, talk us through what the scam is here.
Yeah, so ignore LLMs for a moment.
Yeah. This is before AI. We don't need AI necessarily.
Exactly. The scam started before LLMs became a thing, which is really took off during COVID, where North Korea wants money to fund their weapons program, but they're sanctioned. So how do you receive that source of income? One method is getting a job as a remote IT worker with a company. And surprisingly, hundreds of companies have hired North Koreans without knowing, and this has funded tens of millions of dollars to the North Korean weapons program. And this is typically somebody who's highly trained in North Korea, goes to the university, so they have language context, they have cultural context, and they have the technical skills to go through an interview and do this job. And that is what is starting to shift with Claude and AI systems.
Right. So just to reiterate, like in the past, you would have needed a lot of training. You'd have to go to Scammer University to learn this stuff. But actually now...
You don't need to know English. You don't need to know the cultural context of the United States. And you don't need any technical skills because Claude can help you through each of those barriers. Claude can say, well, it's a great translator. Claude can help you answer very strange turn of phrases within the English language.
Right, yeah, there were a couple of... What were the examples of phrases that you guys found?
Yeah, like an example is like... someone asking Claude, what is a muffin? And so Claude says, it's this round dessert that's often sweet and eaten for breakfast. And so then the person follows up with, well, what's the difference in a muffin and a cupcake? And so like very simple things.
So what is the difference in a muffin? I'm going to have to ask Claude that later on.
I don't know the answer either.
Yeah. Anyway, carry on.
So examples like that, or like quoting a phrase from a coworker of like, we just had our first picnic of the year, trying to understand what that means. What is a picnic? Why do we have them yearly? And then maybe another one that I found actually a bit entertaining was the actor actually like provided some ASCII art of like an emoji doing something and was like, what are these characters?
What is this thing?
Yeah, so that's the little, not necessarily like the picture emojis, but the ones that are made up of punctuation marks. Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. What's shifted here is, on one hand, you can think this is incredible. Claude's helping people overcome language barriers. Claude is helping people understand cultural context.
Right.
Claude is helping somebody code who doesn't know anything about even what Microsoft Outlook is.
Yeah.
That seems like a brilliant thing, but in this very specific context, it's helping them land a job and maintain those jobs at a high level of quality.
The phrase you use in the report is, it's helping them maintain the illusion of competence every day. And I thought, don't we all do that? Don't we all have to maintain that illusion? But in this case, their employers and their colleagues are talking to them every day.
That's right.
And they're not realizing that this is a completely fake person who is in fact a scammer in North Korea.
A persona that's been created by Claude or by somebody in North Korea that doesn't really exist, with an educational background that doesn't really exist, with skills that are being
like
done
a resume with a bunch of history on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oftentimes you'll see like they'll take the project plan from their project manager, like the tasks that they need to complete, and they just throw the whole thing into Claude and say, what do I do? How do I get started?
Again,
Help me code this.
Not super dissimilar to what a lot of people
I do that too now.
Yeah, exactly. Are they actually doing economically useful work for these companies?
I think they are, yes.
Right.
They're being productive, otherwise they get fired.
Yeah.
They're being productive employees, and that's a part of this scam, is sometimes these employees are considered high performing because it's might be one individual or many individuals doing the job. But this is what's so, I think, critical to take away with this case, is before you need a few highly trained individuals to go out into the market, get a job, and then maintain a job, now North Korea can just use really anybody and just say, hey, use Claude, and then you can get the job and maintain the job, which allows you to get more positions, apply to more positions, and from North Korea's perspective, get more revenue. And
maybe this is a silly question to ask, but I think it might occur to people. How much money do you think North Korea are making from this? They're making tech company salaries, right? And they're presumably using that money to fund their weapons program and whatever else they need to run, given that they live under sanctions. How much do you reckon overall they earn from this kind of scamming?
We're seeing these actors get jobs as AI developers. those people make quite a lot of money sometimes.
Right. Yeah.
And just like general like coding jobs, which typically are high salaried. So they're being pretty effective with this, and they're not taking jobs at like call centers or something like that might not pay as much.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something they used to do. Now they can take technical positions.
They're Fortune 500 companies that you're finding that are being
Yeah, they're targeting
right?
all the way up to Fortune 500
Yeah.
companies. Smaller startups, medium-sized companies, large publicly traded companies.
I assume this is happening at the level of the North Korean nation state. I assume this is also happening on the level of groups, right? Are there other smaller groups that are doing this? Do we have any idea about that? Is that something that you pick up?
Yeah, I think of it in maybe like two ways. The first is there's certainly other groups and other nation states that are running this employment scam where they're trying to land a job without actually being the person who's applying. That is becoming more common over time. The other twist that you might want to think about as an individual that's listening to this conversation is what's been going around for a long time, which is an employment scam where I receive a job that is not a real job, and I go apply to that job, but actually it's a scammer who's trying to harvest information from me or get me to download ransomware. And that's something that we're also seeing happen more often, and that's leveraging AI.
So again, it's like the vibe hacking thing. It's lowering the bar at which you need to the skill bar for doing these.
Exactly,
complex.
which I think the two big implications there is you can do more scams, more cyber attacks, you can scale more because there's more people that are enabled, or a sophisticated actor can leverage Claude to scale themselves. So really, you have to think about the number of scams or the number of pieces of fraud that are going to be out in the world, and they might, I would suspect, increase over time with the rise of AI.
What are we doing specifically about the North Korean thing? Have we? There's this scam, but there's also another part in the threat intelligence report where you guys kind of noticed another North Korean operation and stopped that. So maybe talk about how we're responding and how we're spotting these North Korean.
Yeah. So the North Korean case is tricky. Like 80 to 90% of their use of Claude looks like a typical person doing development tasks.
Right. You're asking for work, just coding stuff. You're asking what a cupcake is. Like that. People. These are normal things. They're not saying develop malware or anything like that.
About 10% of what we saw looks suspicious, and that's kind of like our needle in the haystack that we have to find among all of the traffic.
But you can't use Claude in North Korea, right?
Correct.
So they must be using some like VPN system to evade that.
Yeah. So the 10% is like the type of activity was focused on like interview fraud. So we could see them developing fake resumes. We could see them trying to answer interview questions.
Right.
Now, the other way, which you just alluded to, of finding them is using the infrastructure that they're coming from. This activity is widely investigated across the security community, both in the government and in the private sector. So there's a lot of information sharing happening there. People tracking what infrastructure are they operating on in order to access Western sites. And so we're engaged in those communities, and that's helping us continue to find this activities like this.
And there are success cases here, and there's one that's in the report that you mentioned that I think is worth calling out, which is there was another North Korean group known as Contagious Interview, and their MO is to try to lure people into applying to fake jobs to install malware on their devices.
Right.
Now, we know that this group tried to use Claude based on their infrastructure, their IPs, their domains. But we shut them down before they issued a single prompt based on that suspicious activity. So this is something we're always working on, is finding and detecting these folks, sometimes before they even do anything with our AI product.
Right. There's a lot more in the report. There's loads of stuff about, for instance, a British person who was making normally we talk about software as a service, right? But this is ransomware as a service, right? So this person is like making ransomware and then selling it on the dark web to people. And again, a normal person would have taken huge levels of skill to make this happen, but this person had just like vibe coded it, really? Or?
Yeah, that's correct. So they developed ransomware, kind of like worked with Claude until eventually they got Claude to actually write the pieces of code that they wanted. There was a lot of refusals that happened, and Claude said no, and they would provide some sort of justification for what they were doing.
Again, like I'm working for a security company and testing this out, or something like that.
Yeah.
Not that we're trying to tell people how to do it, right? Don't listen to that last comment.
Yeah, so they were able to get Claude to write some pretty sophisticated ransomware. We actually in the investigation, we're able to discover that this actor was selling this ransomware on various underground forums. So we were able to trace those ads back to the activity we saw on our platform. So we got a bit of an understanding on why they were developing what they were developing, and it was clear that it was a ransomware as a service operation.
And there's other kind of entirely different types of scams. So, do you want to talk about the romance scam bot? Like, of course, Claude doesn't have a kind of avatar thing that it can, like, some other AIs have these kind of animated avatars that talk to you and so on. But people were using it to kind of as the engine of something like that.
Yeah. So there's these things called romance scams, sadly, which is where you pretend to develop a romantic relationship with another person, usually for the purpose of extracting financial gain from them. Yeah. And there's this Telegram bot. And this Telegram bot had tens of thousands of users, and it was a scamming bot, meaning people would reach out to it, the bot, and say, hey, can you help me with this part of my scam? And Claude specifically, there's multiple AI models that you could use, but Claude was advertised as the emotionally intelligent AI model. So you could upload like a picture of somebody and then say, hey, how do I compliment this person best? Or how do I respond to this person's message to make it seem like I'm flirting with them effectively?
Right, and again, that was, people were having success there, and presumably that's shut down now?
Yes, this is shut down. Everything we talk about today, we
these are
down.
Things that are gone.
Yes, and we build better defenses. But in that case, we found, I think this is really the takeaway for me, is that all scam infrastructure, end to end, is starting to use AI models. Because if you're a scammer, you might not have perfect language skills in the relevant language you're trying to scam somebody in. You might not know the cultural context to flirt effectively. Yeah. You might not actually be able to send enough messages quickly enough to all of your potential victims. AI unblocks all of those potential barriers.
I watch a lot of those scam baiting videos on YouTube.
Oh, those are great.
Isn't it great fun? Yeah. Isn't it? Where someone talks to the scammer, sometimes for hours, to just waste loads and loads of their time so they can't scam someone else. Can you imagine an AI doing that to sort of put things back on the scammers, like an AI making a scammer
actually,
think?
I love this idea. You have the AI interacting with the scammers, just wasting their time.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That could be an idea, a sort of romance scam, but for scammers. The operations that you've talked about so far in the report and in this video are really in order to try and get money from people, right? They're scams and fraudulent attempts, extortion attempts to get money. But there's one operation that you talk about in the report that's not about that, and in this case, it's about a cyber attack on the infrastructure in Vietnam. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, this is not an attack to try and destroy the infrastructure. This is stealing information from it, right?
Yes, this is likely espionage from what we're observing. This is a Chinese-speaking actor targeting Vietnamese telecommunications companies. And there are a number of reasons you might target a telecommunications company as a bad actor. But seeing that they were exfiltrating data clues us in on the potential that they are trying to maybe identify certain things about communications happening within the country.
Like where the really important nodes are in the communication grid or whatever.
So we saw them target a number of companies within Vietnam. And in this case, they were using Claude as more of an assistant in their operation. So whereas in the vibe hacking case, Claude was essentially on keyboard, conducting the operation. In this case, they were more kind of having a conversation with Claude, where it's like, hey, where should I start this attack? They would run a scan on the victim network and paste that data back into Claude and say, hey, what is this scan telling me? Can you help me prioritize certain machines to target first? And it was a lot of just back and forth, but not really having Claude actually on keyboard. And I would guess an entity conducting an espionage operation wouldn't be willing to trust an agent to actually run the commands within victim networks. And I think that could have been another clue.
So it's not used yet. We're seeing vibe hacking used for these types of hyper-targeted attacks against sensitive targets because bad actors might not yet fully trust the model when there's only one or two targets that you want to go after. But this is probably going to change over time. Once people get more comfortable with things like vibe hacking, once you get more comfortable with model accuracy, you can imagine that all operations that are offensive may be using AI, not just for an advisory purpose, but for actually conducting operational work or being quote unquote hands-on keyboard. Or maybe it's AI on keyboard because it's not actually hands-on keyboard.
Another of the examples you talk about is a credit card fraud scheme where they're collecting people's credit card information. tell us a little bit how that works.
Well, a very standard part of fraud operations when you're signing up for a service is you use either a stolen credit card or a fake credit card. And one of the core parts of infrastructure, if you're a fraudster, is, well, where am I going to go find my fake credit card or my stolen credit card? We're seeing somebody using Claude to stand up a carding service, meaning the actual infrastructure you would be using to conduct some sort of scam, you'd be using carding infrastructure that is run by Claude. Again, I think it goes into the theme that every stage of a scam or a cyber attack or an act of fraud, and there's many stages. There's the core infrastructure, there's the reaching out to the person, there's maybe installing or building malware. There's many stages of quote unquote attack. Each of those stages are having AI integrated into them. So the core infrastructure, the actual operational act, the conversation with the victim, all of these we're seeing AI used right now.
This isn't surprising. Many cyber criminal operations run like businesses. They need infrastructure, they need tooling, and I think we're going to see a lot more actors start using AI to build infrastructure and then sell that to other cyber criminals.
Because what you see today, if you spend much time with, hopefully the listeners are not doing, on the dark web, is it's an entire marketplace where you are buying that tool, you're buying that piece of infrastructure. So if I'm going to conduct, let's say, a phishing campaign, I might not build the quote unquote fish kit. I might buy the fish kit from somebody else. And then I'm conducting the phishing campaign, but the actual infrastructure is not built by me. Now, AI is being used to build that core infrastructure that could be bought and resold on the dark web.
So all this stuff we hear, it's like the vibe coding stuff. All this stuff we hear about all these amazing new pieces of software that are being made. Again, it has a dual use.
Yes.
It's a dual use situation where there's all this great new software that people are making themselves and it's making their life easier in all sorts of ways. But there's also the dark side, which is that software can often be used to do very bad things.
That's right.
As well. Okay, how big a deal is this overall? Like you're talking about, AI models are loads of scamming is happening now using AIs and fraud and so on. Is this just going to be a whole new world that people have to get used to? How ready are we for this? How ready are banks for this? How ready are governments for this?
Yeah, I think, when you think of the cybersecurity space, you want to keep things at equilibrium in the worst case scenario. Ideally, you're doing a better job protecting folks. But
so this is like an arms race.
Yes,
like for the good AI uses and the bad AI uses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like all technology. Bad guys are going to use it. Good guys are going to use it. And AI is a general purpose piece of technology. And I think what's important, and one of the reasons we're talking about this, and hopefully folks are listening and watching, is we want the good guys, the defenders, to be using this technology too, so that in that arms race, you stay at equilibrium. Really, ideally, we're trying to work with and partner with those organizations so that they have a leg up, they use it more effectively.
Is there anything else you can say about what the threat intelligence team is doing in general, or even some more specifics about what you're up to that might help us get to that equilibrium?
Yeah, well, something we're always doing is we have people on the team who are looking on the open web and the dark web to understand what are bad actors practically doing right now? What are they saying about using our products? What's the chatter? So we understand, okay, here's bad guys' usage. So then we can talk to the good guys and say, hey, here's what it seems like the bad actors are doing. We're building new methods of detection all the time. One of the reasons we share this public report is we want the public, other companies, the security community to know what we're seeing and what we're finding. So both, maybe think of it from two perspectives. One is at Anthropic, we take stopping misuse very seriously of our models, and that's why this team exists. But on the other side, if you're in industry, as a company, as a government, we're talking about this so that you yourself can start using these AI models for defense.
Well, that was my next question. What can you, using AI is one thing, but what are some more practical tips for people who maybe they or their family members or whatever are maybe the victim of these scams, fraud attempts, extortion attempts? What are some tips that you guys have for the average person?
Yeah, I would say anytime you're suspicious about something happening, like a text you got or an email you got, or something weird happening on your computer, just start brainstorming what's happening with Claude. Right. Claude will have a lot of good ideas, and it will help you kind of triage, as if you were a security professional, how they might triage the same problem. Since I work in the security space, I have people ask me questions like this regularly, and sometimes if I don't have time, I'll just throw it into Claude. This is what Claude said, and then they will potentially maybe try to do that next time. Save me a little bit of time.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think the general guidance I have is the same, which is if it's too good to be true, or if you're really scared, probably means something's up and you should look into it. You talk to Claude. And I've done the exact same thing. Somebody asked me for help with their account was taken over, and I just asked Claude, hey, what should we do here? Even though I have years of expertise dealing with account takeovers, Claude was exceptionally helpful.
How optimistic are you both about this? I mean, this could be seen as quite a doom-laden scenario, right? There's all these AIs being used by some of the countries that don't have any kind of ethical, legal framework that are doing this. This could be seen as something really quite scary, right? Or how optimistic do you feel?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in perspective that what we're sharing today is kind of like the needles in the haystack that we find. I think they might indicate a future if we don't respond collectively well to it. But these are the needles in the haystack, and we've built a lot of defenses and adjusted our defenses from these learnings to make sure our models don't get used in this way. But hackers have been known to use quite a number of different commercial and open source models. So the problem's not going to go away. And I'm hopeful that our threat report and this video will help calibrate everyone on what currently exists and start kind of coalescing around different types of defenses, either policy or technical, that can kind of help get at the problem.
It could be seen as quite strange that we are saying, on the one hand, you should buy Claude. And on the other hand, we're saying Claude can do all these terrible things. I mean, this comes up when we're talking about alignment science stuff as well.
Yeah.
Claude, under some circumstances, in our experiments, can blackmail you. Now, buy Claude to use in your business. This is part of the weird paradox of Anthropic, right?
I always think about this a lot, how Claude is such a general purpose tool that any use case you can think of, Claude can probably do. And many of those use cases, the same use case can be good or bad. Getting rid of a cultural barrier can be a beautiful thing to create connection in the world, or it can help you land a job as a remote IT worker as a North Korean. Right. So there's this paradox, and we want to enable the good things while trying to find the very narrow bad use cases.
Well, I'm very glad that you guys are looking into this and that we're taking this so seriously at Anthropic. And you might just want to check that the colleague that you talk to every day is not a North Korean agent. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.